When I say that I once worked as a direct care assistant for a 65-year-old woman with a developmental disability, I mean that I worked for them just this one night, and you're going to hear why I never returned. Her daughter, who was in her 40s, needed a caregiver with medical experience to watch her overnight, because she worked overnights. Martha, a 65-year-old lady, and Colleen, her daughter, were the ones who got in touch with me. Colleen could have felt more at ease employing someone with some kind of expertise to look for Martha at the time, or she might have had no other relatives to look after her and didn't want to or couldn't afford to place her in a nursing facility. Although I had prior experience providing direct care for two other ladies with developmental disabilities, nothing prepared me for that evening. Colleen went for work earlier that day, and because it was my first job, I was working incredibly hard to earn as much money as I could. Colleen had presented me and Martha. It was around 9 p.m. when Martha smiled at me, and Colleen took her upstairs to her bedroom for the evening. Colleen informed me that Martha occasionally acted confused while walking around the house at night, and that I would need to calm her down and take her back to her room. She clarified that this was not sleepwalking when I asked, stating that it was one of the signs of her mother's dementia. I told her to relax, confident that I would know how to deal with it. I started in the living room watching my show. These jobs aren't very glamorous and mostly involve sitting around. I heard footsteps coming from upstairs, so I went to the stairway and looked up the stairs. When I called Martha's name, she didn't answer, so I heard her footsteps go back to her room, and then the door closed, possibly because she went to the bathroom. I went back to the living room and watched more TV. An hour or so later, I got up to get my sandwich that I had brought from the refrigerator. I was leaving the kitchen with a plate and my sandwich to return to the couch, and I almost had a heart attack dropping the plate. When I saw Martha standing at the doorway, the glass shattered. Everything she said at this time was in a loud shout, "Why are you here?" I don't know you things of that sort. I apologized to her and asked if she was all right. She began ranting at me. "Who are you?" I told her that I am her direct care worker here to make sure she's okay. I attempted to reassure her by telling her that I was simply there to help and that I had been assigned to aid her. However, her eyes were wide with uncertainty and terror, and it was obvious that she was having trouble identifying me in the middle of her anguish. In an attempt to close the distance between us, I inhaled deeply and extended my hand softly. I whispered, "I'm here to help you. I promise," attempting to be sincere in both my tone and my facial expression. After a few hours, I was so tired that I had to get a few hours of sleep. There was a spare bedroom upstairs with a twin-sized bed where Colleen said I could rest if needed. I reminded her that we had just met and that her mother, Colleen, had hired me to watch her and the house. This seemed to work long enough for me to get her to come back upstairs with me. I brought her up to her room with a glass of water, some melatonin, and Kazam. I made sure she took both before heading back downstairs. I fell asleep in a matter of minutes, but I was only sleeping for an hour or so until I woke up to a sound coming from below. It was a repetitive slinging sound with something slamming from downstairs every 1 to 2 seconds. I jumped out of bed and left the bedroom door open in case Martha got up. When I reached the stairs, I realized that the slamming was coming from the kitchen, so I walked as quickly as I could while staying silent. When I reached the bottom, I looked around the kitchen opening and saw what looked like a scene from a scary movie I had seen before. Martha standing in the dark in front of the oven, repeatedly opening it and slamming it shut. It was horrifying. When I say I saw Martha, I really only saw her silhouette because the kitchen was so dark. I said, "Martha," loudly, and she stopped, turning to her left at me. I closed the oven door for the last time, and she began to walk toward me and the stairs. I asked her, in a softer, more scared-sounding voice, "Are you okay?" And she walked past me to her room, where she slammed her door shut. I knocked on the door and asked, "Martha, "Are you okay?" But she didn't answer, so I quietly opened it to take a look inside and saw Martha standing at the side of her bed, facing the wall. I've seen a lot of scary movies, but this was some pretty unsettling behavior that I feel like is exactly the kind of thing you'd see in some scary movies. As I mentioned earlier, I walked over to her, gently eased her into the bed, covered her, and said, "Good night, Martha," for what I hoped would be the last time. I went to the spare room upstairs and went back to bed. I deliberately tried to avoid falling asleep for at least 30 minutes in case she woke up again, but I don't even know if I managed that long. I just know that I fell asleep pretty quickly and woke up again, but much later the room was still completely dark, and the 1-hour alarm I had set had not yet gone off. I looked around the room, wondering what had woken me up, but I couldn't see what it was until I heard a sound coming from inside the closet. Then I noticed the cracked open closet door and the black shadow of a head peeking out of the closet once more, and I nearly had a heart attack. I repeatedly yelled, "Martha," until she pulled the door open and I saw her, but she didn't respond. She began to approach the bed slowly and began saying the same thing she had been saying hours earlier. "Who are you? I don't know you." As she got closer, I tried to calm her down by reminding her who I am. I reached for the lamp next to the bed and fumbled with it until it turned on. At this point, everything changed. Martha was now a threat to my life, and I had to worry about myself, not her. I screamed, and she put down the kitchen knife. I suppose my scream agitated her because she began to yell back at me, continuing to say, "I don't know you. I wasn't going to try to calm down a knife-wielding dementia patient." She screamed once again as I went for it and sprang from the bed on the side further away from her after planning a route to go around her in the bedroom. As I sprinted by her, she swung the knife into the air. It was a feeble and sluggish swipe, but it was clear that she intended to use it. "Who are you?" Instead of dialing 911, I walked downstairs, got my shoes, and went outdoors. Colleen asked me to phone her if there was a problem, and I did so politely since involving the police is never beneficial to anybody. Colleen was screaming into the phone at me to stop leaving her, and to be honest, I yelled back that she tried to kill me and that I didn't call the police because she had to leave work. Of course, I stayed outside the house until Colleen came back, making sure Martha didn't go anywhere. When Colleen went inside, Martha was asleep in her bed. Colleen even went so far as to accuse me of exaggerating the entire situation until she discovered the knife next to Martha's bed. I didn't mention that I ever went to sleep, but that doesn't mean that I felt guilty in any way. Colleen even offered me that room to sleep in. In my 9 years of working as a direct care assistant, Martha was a scarier patient than I had ever encountered in any of my jobs. On my first day of work for this plumbing company, I was called in for my first job at this house out of town. The plumbing company had 5 employees, and the owner would decide who did what. I don't think it's a coincidence that I was sent to some unfavorable job for a far-off shabby. The call was for a leaky pipe under the sink, which is usually the simplest and most basic job to receive a call for, depending on the underlying cause. When I arrived at the house for my first time ever, I found it to be completely run down and disgusting, as if no one had lived there for years. I knocked until a middle-aged man answered the door, and I didn't like his aura right away because he had this unflattering, disproportionately wide smile that made his entire face look off-putting. His voice was also very soft and high-pitched, which wasn't the voice I expected to come out of his mouth. He welcomed me inside the house, and I noticed that there wasn't a single piece of furniture there. I asked him, and he said yes, and then he laughed, or perhaps I should say, he giggled because it was just a strange, high-pitched little laugh. He led me to the kitchen where I put my belongings on the counter before opening the cabinets under the sink. As I crawled under the sink and began inspecting the pipe, paying particular attention to the P-trap and the lock nuts to make sure they weren't too tight or loose, I became aware that the guy was standing just above me. I politely asked him to give me some space, but not enough to make me feel comfortable. When I noticed that there was no water leaking at all, I got out from under the sink and tried turning on the faucet, but it didn't work. I looked at the strange man and asked him why, and he said that he must have accidentally turned off the main water valve. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I stood there for a few seconds dumbfounded. How do you do something like that by mistake? He grinned and shrugged his shoulders. I asked him to turn the water valve back on, and he said he would be right back. I watched him leave the kitchen, but then I heard footsteps coming upstairs. I had never heard a water valve upstairs in any house before. From the state of the house to his mannerisms, I knew something was wrong with this guy and the situation. Then I heard several sets of footsteps coming down the stairs from upstairs, and in a split second I decided to leave. I gathered my belongings and hurried to the front door and my van, because I'm a big, noisy guy, and I don't get intimidated easily by people physically. But there was something about that situation and that guy that told me that some were about to go down. I took a moment to look at the house, and then I drove away. I called my boss Dave and told him it was a prank, because it sounded better than me saying I was afraid of that guy. I looked into it for a few minutes and found it to be nothing more than an empty, deserted home. Dave provided me with the number that called about the purportedly leaking pipe. However, it was really a voice-over IP number. I also informed the local police station about this unusual interaction, so they would be aware of it and maybe shut that place. Since then, I've never had a cause to go back to that dubious area of town. I worked for that particular plumbing company exclusively for about a year back in 2019. That night, I started working for Domino's because I needed the money for college supplies for my dorm, etc. And when you're being trained, the manager goes with you on your first few deliveries to see how you're doing, evaluate you, and train you. It was late, around 8 o'clock, and we received an order. Since our store wasn't as electronic as it is now, we couldn't see the locations on a large TV, so we had to look them up on our phones for directions. We got the directions, and I still remember ordering 4 large pizzas and 2 bottles of Pib, which we loaded into my car. It was me, since I was the one being assessed. It took us about 15 to 20 minutes to get there, and the house we were going to was way out of the way in the middle of nowhere. My town was old, so it was fairly common to go miles without anything. The house looked really old. It was a 2-story house that was completely run down, with wood chipping and some windows having boards on them. It was not a house you'd expect people to live in. I remember asking my manager if we had to go up there, and he said yes, but that he would accompany us and serve them pizza and sodas. When I reluctantly stepped out of the vehicle, I saw that the other new man was also somewhat anxious about approaching the front door. We eventually began heading there when the other trainee said he thought he saw someone watching us from the upstairs window that was the furthest from us. Our manager assured him that this shouldn't take more than a minute or two and that he's just being paranoid. I'm not sure how I mustered the courage to ring the bell, but I did, and it obviously didn't work. My manager then pounded on the door, music, and waited for about 15 seconds before knocking again, this time more forcefully. But there was a rotten smell that we couldn't tell if it was the house or if something inside had died. Finally, after a minute or so of impatient waiting, someone opened the door, but only partially, asking who we were and what we wanted. The older man, who was in his 50s at the very least, told us that it took him a while to open the door because it's difficult for him to get around or something. Our manager gave him the receipt and asked if he was paying with cash or a check. The man said he would be back with the money. This scared the 3 of us out. My manager said we had their pizza. He had left the front door open, so I walked around to see how the house looked. It was entirely empty, with just the floor and a few blankets for furnishings. It was clear that this man was homeless and was simply living here since no one else was. We became uneasy about the situation when we heard footsteps coming from upstairs, and we realized that someone was probably watching us as we walked to the front door. My manager yelled out, "Is the man here yet?" But he never received a response, so the footsteps stopped, and everything just stopped. You could only hear the three of us breathing. My manager told us to stay at the front door in case the man returned, and he said he would go around the house to see if the man needed help or anything. We nodded at him, and he walked towards the back. The two of us heard footsteps, but they weren't coming from upstairs. Instead, they were coming from below us. In some way, we both looked completely perplexed, confused, and genuinely uneasy about the whole situation. I've never driven a car faster in my life, but that's when we heard our manager scream and heard frantic running. He ran to the front of the house where we were both, and told us to get back in the car and leave. He explained to us that as he was walking around to the back, he noticed a group of people in the dark around a small makeshift campfire. As he got closer, he noticed a baby deer in the middle, and the group of men were sitting around laughing at it as if it was funny. The moment he said that, my heart nearly stopped, and I quit the new guy immediately. I heard the manager quit a month later, and I'd never worked a delivery job again. Obviously, we entered some sort of cult meeting, and I'm just glad we left when we did all. The eerie laughter still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of that day. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something far darker than just a job gone wrong.